Shalom Aleichem. We're learning the Sicha of Shelach Gimel. Now, what's interesting about the Sicha is it was originally said in two parts, 5 years separate. And then it continued 5 years later. So basically, part one was Shelach Tavshin Lamed, and part two was Shelach Tavshin Lamed Hey. Now, in the first time the Rebbe said the Sicha, the Rebbe offered an answer, which 5 years later he actually rejected. And if you actually go into the Sicha of that we're learning in our 16, footnote 16, you'll actually see that the Rebbe offers the answer over here as a l'chayra, seemingly. Now, at the time, the Rebbe actually offered it as an answer. But then 5 years later, the Rebbe came and said, "This is noch schwer, it's still a problem." And then the Rebbe went on to give the answer that he gave. But I want to just focus on a few interesting points. There's a lot of things that didn't make it into the final edition, and some made it into like footnotes. But I want to focus on the Sicha of Tavshin Lamed of 1970. It's interesting, both times the Farbrengen led into the similar topic of Miu Yehudi. Something that the Rebbe spoke extensively, especially in the 70s, was this idea of that in the Israeli government, they wanted to put in the law that a Jew is anybody that converted, but they didn't want to put in the word kahalacha. And therefore it shaked up the whole definition of what a Yid is, at least from the government perspective. And the Rebbe was, the amount of pain it caused the Rebbe is just, I don't have to exaggerate it. You just look at what the way the Rebbe talks. I believe that one time the Rebbitzin Chaim Mushko mentioned that the two things that caused the greatest pain to the Rebbe, I'm not sure exactly what expression she used, was Miu Yehudi, and I think something to do with Bachrim. But Miu Yehudi was one of them. It caused the Rebbe incredible agmas nefesh. So it's interesting that both sichas led to that. Now, let me just show you. Here we go. After the Rebbe said the Sicha and Tavshin Lamed, the first answer that made into footnote 16, the Rebbe said like this: we could also explain what it means Sart Silam, that their shadow went away, and it says Maginam Macheskam, their strength and their security, the people who watched over them. Ksherim Shem Mesu, the Ksherim died, and Iyov, who was watching over them. And the other Pinsili Shamakim. That the question has to be asked: you said Ksherim, that's multiple people, and then you say Iyov Yachid, singular. Now, if you look in the Sicha, it did make this point did make it into the Sicha, but in footnote 18. I just thought it's interesting to highlight it. Then the question is, why is it not enough to say Ksherim Shebehem Mesu, and then you have to mention Iyov? In other words, why do you have to say if it was Iyov or somebody else? In other words, the Rebbe says, and another way of putting it is, from the fact that it says Ksherim, multiple, means that it wasn't only Iyov, it was other people. So it wasn't, the death of Iyov didn't suffice because there was other people that could have watched over them. So you have to say that they died. So just like the Ksherim, you didn't say who they were, so you didn't have to mention Iyov. In other words, what's the paradox? Now, even though the Gemara does say that Iyov was securing over his generation, as the Gemara in Baba Basra says, and he did die at the time the Meraglim went to Eretz Yisrael, the Gemara says this idea that Iyov died not on the pasuk Sart Silam, but rather on the pasuk Hayesh Ba'etz, earlier in the parsha, when Moshe Rabbeinu tells them the Meraglim before they go to check if there's a tree. So the Gemara says check somebody, see if the person who lives as long as a tree, Iyov, who had a long life, is still watching over the generation like a tree watches over people. But Rashi, when he says the words Hayesh Ba'etz, he only says Im Yesh Ba'em Adam Kasher. There's only a kosher person. He doesn't say Iyov. So why does he have to mention it in Sart Silam? And why does Rashi have to bring a second shot, etc.? So I just want to focus on this Iyov thing. I just think it's interesting. As you see over here, the Rebbe went on to talk extensively about Miu Yehudi and about rabbis overstepping and not knowing where they're supposed to be doing, etc., etc. Went on for a while. Then the Rebbe went like this. The explanation in Rashi. It's not understood. In other words, this explains Rashi. The question was like this: why Sart Silam happened now? L'chayra, Bris Ben Apsarim what that happened with Avram Avinu 430 years prior, it already then said the fourth generation is going to return, because until then the Amori will not have sinned enough, or their reward would not have been paid out. Lo shalom avayna Amori. So the Jewish people technically should have been able to go into Eretz Yisrael right away after Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why only a year later? Because the Meraglim happened a year later. But Shana Hashem is Eretz Yisrael, could they go in? And Rashi explains, because now Ksherim Shem Mesu. Until now, even though Shalom Avayna Mari, the Mari sins piled up and they deserve to be kicked out, nevertheless, the Ksherim Shabahem, just like we find by Sodom, that some people could have technically, if had he found 10 or 50 people, they would have secured for the rest of the people. So too, the Ksherim Shabahem kept them going. And therefore, Rashi must say, Ksherim is Lashon Rabim, just like Sodom. Because in order to watch over the place, you need at least 10 tzaddikim. How do we know that? Because Avram didn't ask for less. If one would be enough, Avram should have said, maybe there's one tzaddik. No, the moment Avram realizes there's no 10, he's out. Shavlam Kemi goes back. Now, says the Rebbe, the Ben Chamish, the Mikra will come and ask, how did Kalev know that the Ksherim Shabbat Mesu? He wasn't a Navi. He didn't hear this from Moshe. How could he come and tell the people that the thing that was keeping them going for this extra year is over? Says Rashi, Iyov Shayam Magen Aleim. Rashi comes and says Iyov. Why? Because Rashi already said regarding the Meraglim, Eretz Echelos Yisrael. What did Rashi explain? That we found wherever we were going, they were burying people. And then Rashi explained, Hashem did this as a favor so that people should be occupied with burying and not focusing on. So based on this, it's not a question to know how did Kalev know that Iyov died, because Kalev was by the Levi of Iyov, because Iyov was a tzaddik gadol, and he was famous all over the land. And how long he lived 120. He lived more than 120. He lived 140 years, according to the Sefer Iyov, and he had daughters, etc. So when he died, everyone was by his funeral. So the Meraglim knew that Iyov died. And this is how Kalev understood that their shadow is gone. Why? Because Iyov, who was watching over them, died. Now, it must mean if Iyov died and Hashem was doing it and they saw multiple people die, that Hashem was doing this so that we could come into Eretz Yisrael. But we don't know the names of the other people. They weren't as famous as Iyov. And because they're Meraglim, they can't walk over at every funeral and they say, whose Levi is this? Who are you burying? Usually by chuppah, people are like, who's getting married? But usually you don't show up to Levi and say who's getting buried. But who knows? You could also ask that. But they're Meraglim, they can't ask because they're spies. It's just such a fascinating point the Rebbe brings out over here. I just thought it was like beautiful to share. And it's all short, in very short version. You could see this all in footnote 17 and 18 in the Sicha we learned. Then the Rebbe goes on to explain that the combining Chassidus, etc. The Rebbe spoke about this extensively, and I encourage you to go to this Farbrengen, Shelach Tavshin Lamed, to go all the way to the end of Farbrengen. The Rebbe spoke about literally till the end, and then the Farbrengen, talking about various lessons, and also in the Sicha of Tavshin Lamed Hey, various other interesting, fascinating insights. L'chaim, Shalom.